The Metaverse has a groping problem already.
Metaverse company to offer
Big brands
immortality
are
through
jumping
live
into the
forever
Metaverse.
mode.
The Metaverse has a groping problem already.
Metaverse company to offer
Big brands
immortality
are
through
jumping
live
into the
forever
Metaverse.
mode.
The Metaverse has a groping problem already.
Metaverse company to offer
Big brands
immortality
are
through
jumping into the
live forever
Metaverse.
mode.
The Metaverse has a groping problem already.
Metaverse company to offer
Big brands
immortality
are
through
jumping into the
live forever
Metaverse.
mode.
Are we good?
Yes.
You're live.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. So my name is Rajesh, and I head the technology, media, and telecoms law practice at Raja & Tan, Singapore. I've been involved in technology law work for the better part of 20 odd years and seen a few up cycles and down cycles. And today, I have the pleasure of having a distinguished panel of speakers who together with me will be sharing on the metaverse, and in this particular session, focus on how the ethical and policy issues with regard to the metaverse are to be addressed. Let me first introduce the four speakers that we have today, and to give you some context around them. Following the run plan, and first off, Dr. Sameer Hinduja, who is the professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida Atlantic University, and co-director of the Cyberbullying Research Center and faculty associate at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard University. What I'll do, just for context, is to introduce all the speakers very briefly first, and I'll come back with a broader explanation later on when we go through and before the start of each of their panels. Next, we also will have Mr. Philip Zaccarelli. Philip is the Director of Ethics and Compliance Risk for DXC Technology and responsible for driving the digital transformation of the Ethics and Compliance Program. We also have with us Dr. Hang-Yi Chen, and he's the Managing Director of Meta Intelligence and Founding Director of Metaverse Campus at Zhejiang University International Business School. And we also have with us Nathaniel Lim. And Nathaniel, as you can see from his snazzy clothes, is someone who's involved in the building of the metaverse. He also comes with 10 years of experience as a lawyer as well. So looking forward to his views also in terms of how the laws and regulations ought to be structured and obstacles that are there in place. So with that introduction, what I want to do is jump straight into the foundational issues. We have a fantastic set of lectures and seminars sessions the rest of today. So, what I hope to do at first instance is to set the scene by speaking a little bit about foundational issues with regard to the metaverse itself and some of the core legal issues that some of you would already be concerned about today. First off, when we talk about the metaverse, there is always a fair bit of confusion as to what are we referring to. Is it virtual reality, augmented reality? For those of you wearing the Oculus headset, Are you, feeling that is it? Are you in this virtual world? And does that define the metaverse? The reality, though, is quite different. This is a very complex structure with multiple experiential approaches, some of which are fully immersive. And this is where you're wearing your goggles and you sort of go into a different space. And in the near term, even more immersive and involving experiences where there is a disconnect between you in the physical space and in the metaverse. The other reality that we are moving into is more of a mixed reality environment, what some refer to as augmented reality, where we're still in the real world and there's a layer of information coming into us and the ability for us to express ourselves both in the physical world as well as in the metaverse almost simultaneously. So there you are experiencing the virtual world in one sense. You're looking at 3D virtual platforms, applications that people are starting to use today. You'll notice, of course, organizations like Facebook pivoting towards Meta, renaming themselves as Meta, and in a sense, going full hog into the metaverse itself. The way in which we experience and consume content will change as well. And so therefore, the question that needs to be asked is, are we therefore moving into a single new space where all of us will coexist in the real world? And there's a degree of singularity in the real world because there is one world, right? It is one person. And now we are taking that presence and moving it into the metaverse with a capital M. Or are we moving from the real world into what will become many mini metaverses, i.e., multiple instances of virtual reality existence, some of which are compatible, others are built as a walled garden. Now, this is a very serious consideration because if it is the latter, where you have many mini metaverses, then very important issues such as compatibility, interoperability, and exclusion of a person's ability and right to access and consume digital assets and content online becomes an issue. And who controls these metaverses? Who decides what you can do and what you can say and what you can buy and what you can consume becomes a very, very important issue to be addressed from a legal, regulatory, ethical, and a policy compliance standpoint. So many examples of what we're seeing today seem to point towards, at least at the early stage, a many mini metaverses scenario. And I want to make sure that that is a thought that's in your mind, because very often we think of the metaverse as one holistic new place that we're all going into. That is an application of our understanding of the physical world erroneously to the metaverse. The correct construct is that you're moving from one reality in the real world into multiple realities, potentially, in the metaverse. The regulatory frameworks, therefore, also have to reflect this reality. And I think these are some of the issues that we'll be discussing later on today as well. Because when you look at things like when Samir, for example, speaks about cyberbullying, there's a perception that cyberbullying is something that exists in the real world, as we all know it does. There's an element of cyberbullying in social media that many of you would have read about, and maybe even some of you may have been subjected to, which happens on Facebook, on TikTok, on various other platforms that all of us are using today, including in the platforms that many of our children are on, like Roblox. And when that's the reality, the point to note is when you talk about the metaverse, are we talking about the same thing? In that, remember, in a metaverse, it is not just about a digital space. It is about you having an alternate presence. If you're cyberbullied in the metaverse, for example, are you addressing the problem adequately if you fix the cyberbullying issue in the metaverse and don't address the downstream impact on the real person in the real world. And when it comes to punishment of perpetrators, where should that penalty lie? Is it sufficient for it to just lie in the real world, or should it apply in the metaverse as well as in the real world? This layering of rights, again, is something that needs to be addressed. A lot of the regulatory constructs that we have today focus on the impact of fraud, cyberbullying, other wrongdoings from the perspective of punishing the person in the real world. Remember this, as we move more and more into the metaverse, our digital identity, our digital existence may have more of a bearing on us than even the physical world. So if the penalty is applied to the real world for wrongdoing done in the metaverse, will that really have the actual impact on the individual? Will it in fact create the possibility of people actually being more aggressive on the metaverse, knowing that while they may be punished in the real world, and they'll find ways of making that as difficult as possible, there is no real way of punishing someone for any wrongdoings in the metaverse. Now, it's not all just bad news here that I want to cover, but these are realities that we do need to talk about. And when you look at that, you realize that one of the biggest mistakes people are making today is conflating digitalization with the metaversal construct. They are very different things. And that's what this panel and the rest of today will be going into, to sort of give you a realization that we talk about metaverses. And as we move into the many metaverses environment, a lot of key areas need to be looked at, not just in terms of technical sufficiency, but potentially regulatory mandate. One example is what you're seeing up on screen here, application programming interfaces. Metaverses can be built on interoperable tools such as APIs and open standards, and many of them are. But in the early stage, I would expect that there will be many wall gardens, many different metaverses, where you can build an avatar, you can buy digital assets, and you cannot easily transport them to another mini metaverse. And that is a problem, right? Because it means that you can't consume what you actually purchased in the optimal way. How is this going to shake down is something that we need to wait and see. It's not something that's set in stone as yet. But what we certainly need to look at is to ensure that interoperability of intellectual property, the recognition of these rights across metaverses, and the usability of tokens, swapping them between the different metaverses are things that need to be looked at from both a legal, regulatory, ethical, and a compliance standpoint. As I mentioned before, when you are moving into the metaverse, you are moving into a construct where there are multiple presence, right? You're dealing in a situation where there's real world property, intellectual property, and tokenized digital assets, leading to a duplication of these assets existing both in the real world and in the metaverse. Recently, when we were acting for a developer, the construct that was used was, I'm going to build a 30-floor condominium, and I'm going to build another 30 floors virtually on top of it. Both these rights coexist. But is there adequate representation of the metaversal existence, that new 30 floors that exist on top? How are those rights to be distributed? Do they create a parallel value? Meaning that when someone purchases a condominium and is given a token to a second, is that a 2-for-1 purchase? Or are we talking about a completely different asset class when you get that token to the metaversal condominium? These are important constructs that we need to think about because they go down to the core issue of valuing assets, ownership rights. In the context of digital assets, the ability to prove that you actually own these assets, to trade in the assets, the need for you to be able to transfer these assets to your successors, your children, as we pass on. these are critical issues to bear in mind, because as we start investing more and more of our time, effort, and money into the metaverse, the regulatory constructs and the way in which we think about the metaverse ethically and from a policy standpoint, I say again, must not be conflated with the discussions we have had all this while with regard to digitalization. That is a very narrow construct and does not properly represent what is actually going on in the world today. So I hope that gives you some of the core issues and concerns that we all need to be aware of. I'm trying to swing myself back to the front of the screen. Okay, here we are. Yeah, and yeah, I've spoken about this issue about conflation with the digitalized world. Super important that we bear that in mind. And the need for us to understand that when talking about the metaverse, it is really a additional layer of assets that people are looking at. And therefore, when looking at it from a legal responsibility and rights perspective, do not conflate it with digitalization. All this leads to a profound sociological impact. It doubles the real world social challenges in the metaverse. There's a multiplier effect as far as negative behaviors and social evils are concerned. I want to stress it also means there's a multiplier effect with regard to the good that we can do in the world in terms of being good citizens in the real world and being good citizens in the multiverse. But again, for those that seek to abuse it, there has to be adequate technical and administrative safeguards. So the panel today is going to also be sharing with you some of these core issues, both from the risk perspective, the opportunities perspective. We'll also be looking at who controls the metaverse, who makes the rules in the metaverse. And also to sort of bear in mind that what we're dealing with here is not necessarily a brand new construct, right? When we talk about earlier existences like Second Life, for example, under Linden Lab, the constructs have been tested before. And some of you might say, well, what's new about this? Well, the reality is Second Life existed in a world where the infrastructure, the technical infrastructure, the connectivity infrastructure, and people's readiness from a digitalization standpoint was not at a mature level as it is today. And therefore, a lot of the constructs were not fully tested. Things like Linden dollars, etc., and the early discussions on tax implications of digital currency, the acceptance of digital currency by central banks, for example, was not at the stage that it is today. So that's why we can't look back historically and say that what was done before ought to be applied today. We are truly in a new age, new opportunities, lots and lots of ability, as I said, for the multiplier effect to do good. And with good often comes also the possibility of some degree of commercial abuse. So there is also another angle that we need to look at in terms of competition and antitrust issues. Remember, many mini metaverses means the possibility of organizations creating their own little world. And some of them will have more resources than others. And until such time as interoperability of the metaverses is mandated, some will seek to dominate the space. Is something that is of concern? Should we deal with this issue? Is it an opportunity? So again, points and issues for us to look at and think about during the course of the session today. So I hope that gives you a good context in terms of all of the challenges that are there, all of the opportunities, and how the metaverse is very different. And I want you all to start with this construct of thinking of the metaverse as a very new construct. This is not digitalization. This is well beyond digitalization. The metaverse is not one place. It is many mini metaverses coexisting. And we need to look at it from that standpoint. And finally, remember, when you're seeking to address these issues, both in terms of doing good and in some cases seeking redress or applying a penalty for wrong behavior, applying that penalty, giving that good in the real world would not be sufficient if the laws and the redress is not also addressed in the metaverse. And these are some of the core issues, gaps, areas of improvement that will be there in place. So with that, I want to hand over now to our first speaker, Dr. Hang-Yi Chen, Director of Metaverse Campus at Zhejiang University. And Doctor, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Rajesh, for your kind introduction. And I will also like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the organizer for the kind invitation. So what I'm going to share is really about like the digital identity in the metaverse. So as you can see from this presentation slide, actually recently I just shifted my career as the startup entrepreneur. So I'm currently the managing director of a metaverse startup, which we provide like the metaverse all-in-one solution for university and for enterprise. So I just wanted to share this because like a few months ago, I started the journey in the metaverse, and I just love all of this because it gives us like an opportunity where we can share our thoughts, where we can meet the people. And I can tell you every day I spend 2-3 hours in the metaverse for the meeting, for like entertainment and so on and so forth. So I think as Rajesh briefly mentioned, I think metaverse, this new industry is quite potential since like the Facebook changed its name last year. And I think most importantly, many people may think that metaverse is just like a bubble and it's just for like the stock market speculation. But from my viewpoint, I think that metaverse can really change the world, I think in the next 10 years. And why I say like that, if you like imagine like back to 10 to 15 years ago, and if you tell the people that we are going to use the smartphone every day, and you are going to use smartphone for those of the video conference, and you are going to have like your daily work via smartphone. Nobody is going to trust you. But since like the Apple and the Android, they started their journey back in 2008, and I think we can see like how many people they spend how many hours nowadays on smartphone. I think back to around 15 years ago, the average time that we spend on phone is only 40 minutes. But coming to 2022, how many hours do people spend on smartphone? That is 4 hours per day. And if we look at those like the generation, the generation for people born after 1997, 1999, they spend even 10 hours on smartphone. And I think that's just amazing. So if we think that metaverse is another new way how people have this kind of interface, multimedia interface, I think this might really change like the next generation. So this is the first thing I wanted to share. So thinking about the history that we have multimedia from radio, we have before that we have newspaper, and before smartphone we have TV, and we have laptop, and nowadays we use smartphone. And how about the next decade or next 2 decades? So I think that is something first we need to think about in terms of the potential of the metaverse. So now I want to talk about the digital identity in Web 3.0 era or metaverse era. And the reason is very simple. I think right now when people sitting in this room and we have our own digital identity, we have our own avatar. So when people talking about the digital identity, the first thing they connected is about the avatar. But actually it's not just avatar. If we look at the Web 1.0 era, I think you can think about your email address is your digital identity. So if you get the email, let's say from Bill Gates, and that email is from Microsoft, and that means a lot. Because the email from the Microsoft is like the credibility, and it's also not just like the unknown company. So that is like the digital identity in the very early stage. So that's why also some of like the hacker they use like people's email, they book people's email address, and they send the through email and to do some like the criminal offense. So that is like in Web 1.0. And coming to the Web 0.0, we have Facebook, we have YouTube, so we have Twitter. So you can see like when Elon Musk he posts something on his like Twitter account, and it just like drive everybody become crazy on Bitcoin. Even we don't see like Elon Musk make the public speech in front of us, and we trust the sentence or the claim like he made on Twitter is really represent Elon Musk. So coming to the Metaverse, we have our own avatar. That's how people building the trust in the Metaverse. So I think having this like the digital identity is very important. So we need to think about how to have like the secure way to protect our digital identity. So that's something we really need to think about in the Metaverse world. And as like just mentioned, we are not going to have the single Metaverse. So how do we like have our single avatar, but represent in like the different Metaverse? That also means a lot. So imagine if you are like a very famous YouTuber and you wanted to go to another platform, and that will be extremely difficult because like the reputation you build on YouTube, that is not really going to copy to another platform, and that's very difficult. So we need to think about how to have the digital identity that could be transferable and that could be also like happen in another platform. And that's something important. So I think last week I had a conversation for like the Visa's internal training course, and that is talking about the Metaverse. And I believe that for those like the digital identity in the Metaverse and who can contribute to this, that could be Visa, that could be MasterCard, because even they already become one of the largest payment ecosystem, payment network, and everybody in the world, I think they almost, we know Visa and we know MasterCard. So when people talking about that, whether Facebook or whether Twitter or whether other big tech giant, they are going to dominate like the whole Metaverse world, I think my viewpoint is quite optimistic. The reason is that if we think about like the internet in very early stage, right, how people talk on the internet, we use ICQ, we use Yahoo Messenger, we have MSN, that how we communicate. So when people thinking about that, we are feel nervous about like the monopoly in the Metaverse, but my viewpoint is I don't think so, because that eventually that in internet you need to provide like the best quality and also to care about like customers' convenience. So even Yahoo Messenger and MSN, they want to be very giant in like the social networking, but it soon be replaced by Facebook and Twitter, because that we come into Web 0.2 and we use mobile phone more often. So when they realized they wanted to shift into this new era, but they are too late. So the next issue I wanted to share with you is that also many companies and many individuals, they have the question, should we really enter the Metaverse at this stage? And I think the answer is yes, because think about like the bookstore in 1990s, and they are very prosperous. When people wanted to buy the book, they go to the bookstore. But how about in the internet era? People just shop on Amazon, they buy the book from Amazon, and they spend time on online shopping. And those like the traditional bookstore giant, they just fail, and even some of them they go bankruptcy. So I think that's the problem. So you really need to think about not just how our generation cares about, but you really need to think about like how young generation cares about. So for example, as I shared in the very beginning, the Z generation, people born in after 2000, they spend more time on mobile. They even spend more time in the metaverse. So if you are the e-commerce platform, if you are very successful in the web 2.0 era, I think it's also the right timing you should consider about the metaverse. Because eventually, if people going to spend more time, let's say they are going to spend 7 or 8 hours, then they are going to spend more time in virtual than in the reality. And by then, if you don't build your brand in the metaverse, there's going to be a problem. So you are going to face the same issue as Yahoo Messenger and ICQ. They used to be very giant in the internet age, but talking about like the big tech giant we know right now, that's Facebook, that's Twitter, and even Facebook. For me, as professor, I taught in the university, and the student even joke me like, "Oh, Professor Chen, you are outdated because nowadays for young generation, we not just use Facebook, but we prefer to use TikTok, we prefer to use Instagram, and that's another new generation." So I think there are like a couple of issues when we talk about the public policy. One is monopoly, but I believe that is not so easy to monopoly the metaverse, even as we see from the historical perspective. Facebook cannot be like the only one in the internet, and also Facebook is also not that popular among young generation. So I think what we really have concern about might not be like really going to be happen in the future. And the next thing I wanted to address, given that I was the professor at the university in China, I do see like the interesting trend is that about like the privacy perspective between like the China and the rest of the world, and particularly those countries in European Union. So when we talk about the privacy, and in the European Union, we have like the GDPR, which is regarded as one of the strict regulation on the internet. So when you wanted to use people's information, you need to follow and comply those regulations. But what happened in China is that people tend to give like the privacy, or they wanted to compromise because they also wanted to be beneficial from those convenience. So I think as like the business, as the entrepreneur, as the big tech company, you also need to think about what's your strategy in different countries and how to promote like the business in the metaverse, because people's perception eventually toward this new metaverse is not going to be the same. So that's also cause the problem. And I think nowadays people also talk about NFT, and let's also people say NFT is going to be like how people make the deal, how people making the transaction in the metaverse, because it's based on blockchain, and it's like something that you can prove you own the digital asset. But one thing I wanted to highlight is that NFT is still a little bit not like really like the property we have in the reality, because that unlike the property law, but NFT's relationship between you and the issuer is based on the contract law, and so that's the difference. So the right between like NFT and the real property in the reality is still different. So as the regulator, as like the policymaker, we also need to think about how to protect those NFT if that is something just based on the contract and that's not really protectable for those like the customer or user. And the one thing is that even we have those NFT on the blockchain, and let's say we have some NFT property on Spatial.io, but imagine if Spatial.io once they just terminate their service, all of our property on this Spatial.io is also be terminated as well. So how do we protect like the money that invested by the user? That is also we need to care about, because then we see a lot of fraud in cryptocurrency, in ICO, and that is not something we wanted to see in the metaverse as well. So we have some lesson learned from cryptocurrency and from ICO, and that's something as the regulator, as the public policy maker, they really need to think about. And the last thing I wanted to share is that many people and also many audience of this event, I believe you are a lawyer, you practice in law, and I know Rajesh, you are also the lawyer, the tech lawyer in this field for 20 years. So what you can do right now in the metaverse, I think there are also a couple of potential legal issues you can think about. And that is also regarding the NFT. Because right now in NFT world, it has some issue. Because NFT that could be very unique, but the content of NFT, the piece of artwork might be copied from somewhere and someone's artwork. And that's a problem, and it also causes some infringement, not only like in virtual, but also in the reality and in the states. We also have a couple of cases that is like the dispute between NFT's owner and also like the artist who really produce this artwork in the reality. So to sum up, I just wanted to highlight that for the metaverse world, it's really first thing you need to think about is monopoly issue. But from my viewpoint, the monopoly is not going to be happen in the metaverse, given that internet is changing so rapidly. And think about like the case of Yahoo Messenger or Facebook and Twitter, and it just not really happen in that sense. And the second one is that you also need to think about some statistics to compare how we use like how many times we contribute to the smartphone 10 years ago and right now. And I think that is something we can take as a reference, that we can think about what metaverse is going to change the world in the next 10 years. And the last thing is that the digital identity is very important, because that is the way how you communicate and how you build trust. And I think that is the most important thing in the digital world. And I just wanted to also share with you something interestingly is that when you think about to shop, to use your credit card, it's very easy that you just have your credit card number and the expiring date and also security code, and you can make the transaction on the internet. You can buy any good on Amazon. But that is not going to happen in the reality, because in the reality, you couldn't imagine you can go to the electronic appliance shop and tell them that, oh, this is, I don't bring my credit card and I just wanted to write down my credit card number and can you make the transaction to me? And it's not going to happen in the reality, but that's happened in the digital world already. So what I wanted to share is that we also need to think about some of like the convenience problem. And if we wanted to extend like the usage in the metaverse, I think one thing that we need to care about is infrastructure in terms of how people pay and how people make the transaction. So in the reality, we use like the QR code for digital payment, and we use NFC. For example, we have Apple Pay. But how about in the metaverse? In the Metaverse, we are going to wear the VR goggle, and we don't have the time to scan QR code. We don't have time to use NFC. So will that be possible? We use our voice as like the security measure to make the transaction. So I think that is something I also share to Visa and the MasterCard recent, and I encourage them to come up with the new measure, and that could be something, and accelerate the development in the Metaverse. So I think that is all I wanted to share with you. I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chen. Lots of questions coming in from the audience. Please do keep them coming in. Let's move on now to our next speaker. The next panelist, Dr. Philip Zaccarelli. So, as I mentioned earlier, Philip is the Director of Ethics and Compliance Risk for DXC Technology. Just want to add on that he is also a certified compliance and ethics professional through the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics. So, Philip, tell us how you're going to make this real from a policy standpoint.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rajesh. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. So really kind of the lens that I'm going to apply to the conversation, sitting within DXC's ethics and compliance program is really the types of ethics and compliance risks and issues that an organization is going to need to think through and account for as they begin to use the metaverse. So we can go ahead and advance to the first slide if you guys don't mind. And just as a starting point, right, from my perspective, as organizations begin to use the metaverse, it really is an enabler and an accelerator. And so whether that is, enabling engagement with clients, enabling engagement with employees, or accelerating your sales processes and business development efforts, it is going to accelerate things. But, with that growth and with that acceleration are also going to come an influx of new risks. What you kind of see here on the slide off to the right are really big buckets of ethics and compliance risks, kind of at the 30,000-foot level that many organizations, if not the majority of organizations, really need to account for and manage as part of their core ethics and compliance risk program and risk profile. And I don't believe that the metaverse is going to introduce any new risk domains, any new giant buckets of risk. But what it's going to do, I believe, is increase the probability of sub-risks or scenarios within these buckets, increasing their likelihood that they're going to materialize, and also introduce new flavors or new attributes associated with these risk categories. And so when I was thinking through the various ethics and compliance issues with the use of the metaverse, I kind of bucketed the risk scenarios into two categories, and that is risks in the metaverse versus risks of the metaverse. And I want to spend a little time diving into each. So why don't we go ahead and advance the slides, and we'll start with the risks in the metaverse. And when I say risk in the metaverse, really what I'm referring to is these are existing ethics compliance risks that nearly every organization is currently actively monitoring and managing. And now with the introduction of the metaverse, it's really creating a new channel or a new forum for this risk to materialize. And there's also a chance that for one specific risk scenario, let's pick on the first one that's listed, abusive conduct, that there might be risks that kind of transcend both the platform and what some might refer to as in real life. So if we have an individual who's being harassed or discriminated against, there is a chance that that discrimination, that negative behavior is going to manifest now both in the metaverse, but then also on emails, in virtual calls, even if they're in a physical office location. Now, again, I do think that the metaverse is going to potentially increase the probability and the number of cases of this type of abusive conduct that's going to take place across the organization. And the driver or root cause of that potentially might be because the metaverse feels surreal. I mean, you're seeing it right now. It feels like we're in a game. And with this surreal environment, individuals may feel like they're a little bit more lax, and they might get fully submersed. And then next thing you know, it might be a little bit more challenging to keep certain behaviors in check. that kind of dovetails right into the next risk, the notion of engaging in corrupt behaviors. So whether it's collusion, and we have individuals kind of coming to the platform to align and share information and coerce into different fraud schemes, or even types of bribery. Here I have listed gifts and hospitality, but imagine if an individual is giving digital currency or providing passes or virtual tickets to different virtual events. In return, their expectation would be some sort of favor, right? Favorable business treatment, for example. Now, an underlying root cause for this type of behavior really might stem because individuals may feel like there's a lack of oversight associated with their use of the metaverse. And this could, at this point in time, be real or perceived. But regardless, if individuals feel like that, I've heard terms that right now, the metaverse, to an extent, is decentralized. I think I've read that, it's a little bit like the wild, wild west at times. And if a fraudster or a bad actor hears that terminology, they're going to think that they have a higher chance of getting away with some sort of corruptive act. So they might see the platform as an advantageous avenue to engage in those behaviors. And then lastly, from a data protection perspective, we might be bringing clients onto the metaverse with us now. And whether that is a B2B business where our clients are organizations, or even a B2C business where our clients are individuals, how are we protecting their data? How are we putting in place the guardrails to protect their data? And I think the underlying kind of root cause or challenge associated with this, really at this point in time, going to be almost like a lack of awareness, right? We simply might not understand, the exposure that we're introducing when we're bringing information onto the platform and the technical and digital safeguards that need to be in place to adequately protect it. So again, these are kind of risks that organizations have been managing day in, day out for a long time. And now it's just kind of like a new flavor or a new platform for this risk to materialize. But I also now want to spend a little bit of time, and we can transition to the next slide, talking about the risks to the organization just based solely off the use of the metaverse and its equipment itself. And so the first scenario I want to talk about is inappropriate behaviors. And I'm really centering this around the use of the avatar. So whether that be, the way we're dressing our avatars, its appearance, this is going to be a new channel for employees and customers and third parties to express themselves. And so it's going to be important that, individuals are respecting the way they're presenting themselves. So whether it's dressing in an inappropriate, over-suggestive manner, having attire that maybe has inappropriate language or symbols on it, or even depicting your avatar as a race that maybe you are not part of, or depicting your avatar having a disability that you in fact do not have. I mean, you can take it a step further with how you are going to allow your avatar to behave. Are you going to make it enact inappropriate gestures, or even taking it to a very far extreme, what if there's the ability to make your avatar engage in substance abuse? Kind of going back to one of the root causes discussed previously around, well, this isn't really real life, it's a game. Employees or individuals could argue, oh, I was just joking around, I'm not actually engaging in the behaviors, but it truly is your digital identity. And these behaviors can have a real impact on other individuals and on the brand and reputation of the organization that an employee is representing. Moving on to acceptable usage, and really what I mean by this is how an individual is using the metaverse, assuming that it is the metaverse through the lens of the organization and the equipment, whether it be the Oculus headset, so on and so forth, again, assuming that it is the property of the organizations. And so making sure that they're not abusing that for personal use and personal gain. And to me, the risk here kind of runs the gamut. On the lower end of the risk continuum, you might have instances where your employees are using the metaverse and using the equipment to attend virtual concerts, or maybe they're letting their family members use it to play games, so on and so forth. In the grand scheme of things, maybe not the highest risk. But what about if we go to a different extreme or a different level, and individuals are starting to use the technology and the equipment to fund and to enable a business venture, a side venture, and now they're selling their own goods and services for their personal gain with company equipment. That's not acceptable. Again, I think a potential root cause of this goes back to the notion of that limited oversight. If individuals think they can get away with it, there's a higher likelihood that they're going to engage in that behavior. And then lastly, from a health and safety perspective, how are we going to ensure that everybody has a level playing field? The lens I want to apply is from an accessibility perspective. If an individual has a disability or has a medical condition that prevents them from using the metaverse, how are we going to respond to that? Rajesh was speaking about the different levels of almost like immersion into the metaverse. Okay, if we plan to have an event where we're using the virtual reality goggles and we try to fully immerse ourselves into the metaverse, but we have individuals on the team who cannot do that forever for whatever reason, are we going to take a step back and maybe do it similar to how we're running this session, where we're semi-immersed, I'll call it, right? I'm obviously still in my office, but we're also here in the metaverse. And then secondly, from a physical injury perspective, and again, this is probably more so if you're using that full-on, you're using the VR goggles, you're fully immersed, and kind of the real world, if you will, has disappeared. What if an individual, while the headset is on, trips and falls, hurts themselves? Who's liable for that? And is it different, meaning the liability, if they're in a physical office of an organization versus working from home in their home office? Again, I think these health and safety considerations, they're really in the beginning going to stem from a lack of awareness, a lack of an understanding to really account for these nuances and build in the adequate protocols. So if we have these different risk areas, driven by these underlying causes, we need to start to think about ways that we can identify, address, and control these issues and these risks. So if we go ahead and advance to the next slide, before we kind of get to those potential control measures, there are some foundational challenges that I think any organization is going to run into when approaching to mitigate these type of risks. The first one I want to talk about is everything that I just discussed. These are really stemming from people. These are people risks. These aren't like process risks where we can throw on an automated control and have a high level of confidence that the risk isn't going to materialize. At the end of the day, we're trying to drive and manipulate behaviors, which can become much more difficult to do. Next, if we look at enforcement capabilities, right? If we have instances of misconduct in the metaverse, we need to make sure that we have the ability to investigate, evidence, and ultimately substantiate these cases. Based off the world's capabilities right now, I don't know to what magnitude we will be able to do that, right? Are we going to have the ability to comb through evidence like we can if we're combing through emails, for example? And then secondly, the other dimension to this is we need to have defined policies or legal requirements that we can lean back on to substantiate these cases and drive enforcement. These are the rules per the policy, per the law, and this is why this case is going the way it is. And then lastly, and I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges, like for myself as an ethics and compliance professional, is the way organizations are using the metaverse right now is still developing. So as we're thinking through controls, thinking through what needs to be in place, kind of like we're shooting at a moving target. What holds true today might be different tomorrow, and that can be incredibly intimidating and challenging as we're building out an adequate control environment. So let's go ahead and advance the slide, which this is my last slide. I do want to talk about, as things are still evolving, what some organizations should and could be doing in the interim to start building out the foundation of an adequate control environment to manage these new metaverse-driven risks. And what you see here on the slide to the right are really a number of elements that you would expect to see as part of a core ethics and compliance program. And with slight modifications, slight enhancements, I think you can really begin to build out that foundation in place. So let's start with governance. It's going to be critical to truly understand how your organization is using the metaverse, who's using it, and what is it being used. And based off that, that's really going to dictate the scope of risk that is being introduced to the organization. A simple example would be, are we going to limit the scope of the use of the metaverse just to our internal employees, or are we going to invite clients onto the platform? If the latter, that is a whole nother level of risk from my perspective than if it's internal only. Next, from a policy perspective, we need to update the policies so they account for the nuances associated with the use of the metaverse. This goes back to the enforcement point made on the previous slide. Next, from case management standpoint, we should be tracking the number of cases and risks and issues that have been identified associated with the use of the metaverse so we can really start to understand the magnitude of the problem at hand, assuming there is one. Next, from a comms standpoint, we need to overly communicate with our employees, and we need to be explicit in terms of what the expectation is in terms of the behaviors that we should be seeing on the metaverse. And from my standpoint, I would expect that organizations articulate that the expectation is no different from when you're in real life. Our values, our code, everything still persists when you're in the metaverse. From a training standpoint, you can begin to update trainings to incorporate scenarios that are based in the metaverse. An easy example is if you have an anti-harassment training, let's incorporate a scenario where some of that harassment is stemming from the use of the metaverse, so it begins to come more real for our employees. And then lastly, real-time monitoring and detection. If there's a way to proactively identify any instances of these risks on the platform, that is going to be a huge advantage. It's very similar to how a number of organizations are investing in areas like fraud analytics, where they're proactively combing through different data sets to identify instances of misconduct. No different. It's just seeing if the capabilities are there and the investments. However, I want to talk a little bit about culture, and there's a reason that it's taking up the most real estate on this slide, and that's because I really think this is going to be kind of the biggest driver or detriment to how the platform is. What I mean by that is, if you have a really strong organizational culture, if everybody lives and breathes the values, if everybody is grounded in integrity and doing the right thing and respecting each other, that culture is going to translate and manifest in the metaverse. On the other extreme, if your culture is a challenge, you're constantly trying to manage that culture, correct unwanted behaviors, and going back to that earlier point, the metaverse might actually enable that misconduct and accelerate it. And it's going to become all the more difficult to adequately manage and mitigate. So just one last point I want to make here is that, I know I talked about a lot of the risks and concerns, but I am really excited by the use of the metaverse. I think not only is it a great opportunity for businesses generally speaking, but even for a function like ethics, compliance, legal, a risk management function, there are going to be opportunities to leverage the metaverse to reach our employees, to reach the external environment, and really continue to modernize these type of risk functions. So thank you guys so much. I look forward to hearing the rest of the panel and maybe taking some questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Philip. This has been going extremely well. We started off with Dr. Chen setting out the social risk that we're dealing with when you're on the metaverse. Philip has made it real from an organizational risk perspective and given clear examples of what organizations should do to manage that risk from a risk audit standpoint. Now we're going to zoom in further and deeper into the individual risks. What are the risks to the individuals? And Dr. Samir is probably the best person I can think of to share on the risks in these issues. Again, just to touch briefly on his background for context. What Samir brings to this is his experience as a professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Florida Atlantic University, co-director of the Cyberbullying Research Center, and faculty associate at Edmund Klein Center at University. Samir, tell us, what are risks to individuals now?
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed listening to the other speakers. So first thing that I would like to say is that, Philip set the table for what I want to talk about today. And I appreciate his focus on what the organizations can do. And that's definitely something that we want to keep top of mind as I share with you some of the concerns that I've studied over the course of my life in Web 2.0 and how we might sort of see the translation in the metaverse. First thing that I want to mention has to do with cyberbullying, and that was brought up at the onset. To be sure, there has not been any empirical research, to my knowledge, done on cyberbullying in metaverse properties. Now, we have seen various anecdotal stories shared on Reddit and in news articles where victims have been targeted, and we hear terms such as virtual groping or even virtual rape, which of course happens, and I don't mean to diminish it in any way whatsoever, because of course it's extremely serious, but these cases are also very rare. And so when it comes to cyberbullying, all we can think about right now is, okay, what have we seen in Web 2.0? And just to set a backdrop, allow me to share with you a few numbers. We collected data in a handful of countries last year. We don't have data from Singapore. Data should be collected on the national level, and we're happy to work with partners in order to make that happen. But for example, in Brazil last year, again, a national sample of youth, we found that 40% had been cyberbullied over their lifetime. And of course, that could involve text, group text, private messages on various platforms, gaming platforms, your major social media sites, etc. In France, it was about 20%. So 1 out of 5 youth had been cyberbullied over their lifetime. In Indonesia, another country we studied, it was about 29%. In South Korea, about 1 out of 4. In the United Kingdom, about 2 out of 5 youth had been cyberbullied over the course of their life. And in the United States, it was 46%. So approaching 1 out of every 2 youth in their lifetime had been cyberbullied. So I first want to emphasize that this phenomenon is not spiraling out of control, and it's not occurring to the majority of youth. And I do not expect it to occur to the majority of metaverse users. I don't think it's going to happen. The majority of users tend to use various technological spaces in at least neutral ways, if not in respectful ways. So of course, that's something that we want to see. And then just thinking about other sorts of issues that we've seen crop up over the years, I think about catfishing. I think about how it's so easy to create a fictitious identity and pretend that you're a person that you're not, just to lure someone into a fraudulent romantic relationship. Sometimes, of course, as we all know, there's certain end goals, such as financial exploitation. And a couple of the other speakers brought up the use of avatars, and just thinking about the immersive realism, thinking about the heightened emotionality with which you experience various interactions. I think it would be quite easy to fall prey as you start to flirt, as you engage in dating in the metaverse, etc., because maybe it's not perfectly possible to trust individuals that you meet, verify their identity unless someone solves that age-old problem. And then I also think about age gating situations where what needs to be done here in order to, of course, verify identity so that we can have adult spaces, so that we can have youth spaces. It's going to be incredibly tricky. And of course, victimization can stem from those types of environments as well. Thinking about youth specifically, we know about child grooming. We know that it's been an issue, of course, many years ago in Second Life. And of course, they made a lot of improvements in order to address it. But there again, what are we to do about phenomenon such as sexual age play, where an adult might choose a child avatar and then engage in various sexual activities within a metaverse property with another adult who's using a child avatar? Now, research has not indicated that there's a link between sexual age play and real world harm, but I think that it would probably give you pause and give us cause for concern, because you never know how that might be used in order to normalize the behavior, in order to sort of bolster these inappropriate feelings towards youth. Maybe you have these subcultures spring up in various private and public rooms in the metaverse that rationalize this behavior, that justify it, that provide other sorts of excuses to, again, normalize it. And so perhaps more grooming, more sexual exploitation can stem from those sorts of issues. I also think about hate in the metaverse, and hate is something that I'm sensitive to, hate speech, biased motivated offenses, because I'm a minority and I've dealt with that when it comes to race, when it comes to religion, etc. And so when you're thinking about any of these identity-based characteristics, whether it's race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, of course, that was mentioned by a previous speaker as well. And ideally, again, in a metaverse, everyone is free to use avatars that best reflect who they are. Well, are we going to see a disproportionate amount of individuals choosing to not really reflect who they are simply because they're hesitant about opening themselves up for victimization? We know without a doubt that female avatars have been targeted disproportionately as compared to male avatars. So what can be done about that? Again, because we're hoping to build a metaverse and these immersive environments where, again, individuals feel free to be who they are, to feel comfortable who they are, to be able to interact how they are. And we know about squeakers. We know that young users have been targeted because they have a youthful sounding voice. And so if I have an accent, if I say something that is not culturally appropriate in a certain setting, am I going to be attacked? Are there going to be groups of individuals, including bots, who then gang up on me? And so this is what we've seen in Web 2.0, and I'm quite concerned about it happening in these environments as well. Let me look around and see my slides for a moment, if you don't mind, just to make sure that I cover all of these bases. And thank you for your patience. Marginalized group members, I mentioned. So yeah, I think that we basically covered the spectrum here, even though, of course, there's new instantiations, which will absolutely happen. I would ask you to advance the slides, if you don't mind. For now, I simply want to talk a little bit about, actually, you can go back to that previous slide. My apologies. I wanted to talk about educational opportunities. This is key. So schools, without a doubt, schools are absolutely not doing enough, even though from recent research, at least here in the United States, we find that, or we didn't find, but in one study involving 7,100 youth across the nation, about 1 out of 4 had a head-mounted device. And so they're using it, we'll see, maybe occasionally, maybe regularly, but with this growing prevalence of these devices and more participation in the metaverse, I have to believe that schools should cover this to some degree in some sort of digital citizenship course. Philip mentioned some of the concerns related to harm, related to spatial awareness, et cetera. But I think schools have a captive audience for 6-7 hours a day. And this is so relevant to youth life, so relevant to youth interaction and relationships that we've got to figure out a way to creatively cover it. And even though I know that many schools and educators are focused on getting through the lesson plan, prevention efforts require, merit, demand attention to this topic. Families, when a parent or guardian buys these devices for their child, what sort of education are they providing at the same time? Perhaps they're just assuming that the youth are going to have a proper head on their shoulders and engage in respectful interactions and know how to keep themselves safe. I doubt that's happening because that's not really what we're seeing across youth culture. And then platforms, this was brought up by Philip and also a little bit previously, but platforms have a huge role to play. And we think about, the concept of safety by design, making sure you have all teams involved, whether it's comms, whether it's marketing, whether it's public policy, whether it's trust and safety, whether it's content moderation, whether it's engineering. How are we bringing them together so that each of them have a voice from a different disciplinary background to inform what is being done related to user experience, related to user safety? And then as I get close to wrapping up here, automatic moderation will continue to be used. AI is improving, but I think that we absolutely need human moderation as well. And that could be individuals employed by the company. But I think that, user-driven volunteers is also really, really important because ideally, and this was brought up earlier about the importance of community and culture, they're deeply invested and they care about making sure that people have safe experiences, people have enjoyable experiences. And perhaps they will be keenly attuned to what they're seeing around them because they've been dubbed with the responsibility to take care of this space or that room. So I think that we should tap into that and then figure out a way to incentivize it. Reporting is a big deal. We're finding out in Web 2.0 that yes, all of these platforms have reporting capabilities and features, but for whatever reason, youth and adults hesitate. Is it because they don't believe the app or platform is going to come through? Is it because the app or the platform takes more than 24 hours to get back to them? Is it because there's no follow-up? And of course, research shows that if there's no follow-up, that leads to a further victimization. More trauma can be induced simply because the victim feels like nobody is there to help them. And so, of course, I want platforms and companies that are designing various metaverse properties to focus in on that. Finally, we think about some new adaptations and improvements, such as personal boundary, space bubble, when you're thinking about all space VR, these various ways that we can stop other avatars from invading our space. I think that's really beneficial, but more needs to be done without a doubt. There should be graduated levels of allowed interaction. For example, with my closest friends, perhaps I want chat to be enabled, but perhaps not with others. And then what can we do about some sort of escape hatch option in every metaverse environment so that if you're being attacked, if there's report brigading going on, if there's other sorts of harms taking place, you're able to immediately extricate yourself from that situation without having to experience emotional, psychological, and maybe even physiological harm. So these are the things that I love to think about. You see my contact information out there, and I'd love to continue the conversation with our panelists as well as with others. As I finish, I want to give a shout out to Timothy as well as to Karina for helping us and being our points of contact for this amazing session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Samir. Again, making it real. These are real life impacts, psychological, physiological even, that people can and may suffer in the event of abuse. Now, the metaverse has significant opportunities as much as there are risks. And no better person can share that vision with us than someone who's actually building the metaverse themselves. And so it gives me a great pleasure to have the final speaker for today, Nathaniel, will be sharing his perspective as co-founder of Avium, a decentralized metaverse ecosystem that he's a co-founder and builder of, and also comes with 10 years of experience as a lawyer in technology, gaming, and digital asset space. And so someone will be able to look at this from both an opportunity and a risk perspective. Daniel, all yours. Dan, are you on mute? We can't hear you, Nathaniel. We'll just give another 30 seconds for this to be resolved. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. So not only is there a risk in being in the metaverse, there's also a risk in being the first panel in a complicated attempt to try and move such discussions onto the metaverse. So with such risk, please give us the indulgence as well as we sort out the technical issues. So with that, I think while we wait for Nat's issues to be resolved, we could try and address the questions that are coming in. Right, so Nat's going to try and re-log in, and let's maybe have a look at some of the questions that have come in. The first question that came in was a rather interesting one. So are metaverses really different worlds for the purpose of regulation? As I pointed out earlier, wrongs, for example, cyberbullying, are punishable according to the same set of norms in the real world. But the question that's being put is this: can we not merely use the same laws, but take into consideration metaverse features where they are relevant only when assessing extent of harm, i.e., for example, assessing penalties? And I think this question is an excellent one because it draws into sharp focus two core issues. One is the standard to which an offense is deemed to have occurred, right? So when is a fraud? When is bullying or harassment in a legal sense, looking at the nature of the behavior? And then the second part is sentencing and penalties, and how are those to be imposed? And I take the point that the question has put forth, which is, firstly, we are dealing in a situation where the law itself, in terms of the measure of the bad behavior, will likely still remain the same. So a fraud is a fraud, and harassment is an harassment as well. But the reality is that the manner in which these things are done may require a redefinition or perhaps a clarification of what constitutes the offense itself. So I am in fact saying that there are foundational issues in terms of how we characterize a fraud in the metaverse, simply because of the fact that there's so many ways in which these bad behaviors can be expressed, and that the existing definitions may not adequately cover those scenarios. Yeah. And the second part, in terms of penalties, yes, that's absolutely it. And that's, as I mentioned at my session, having real life penalties has effect, undoubtedly, if you are able to get the perpetrator. But it is necessary for us to also look at the necessary construct. As Dr. Chen has mentioned, with digital identity, the higher probability with which we're able to identify these individuals means that we should, where possible, also ensure that the penalties are enforced, or certainly enforceable, in the metaverse as well. So it's both the measure of what constitutes the harm, as well as the manner in which the penalty is posed that we need to look at. So that what I propose be the proper approach of dealing with the issue. Tied to that, there are also questions about how can there be an equivalent system in the metaverse? That's an interesting question as well, because again, the point there is, how are we dealing with this whole conundrum? Can you create a virtual prison where you throw a person into? And here's where, again, the challenge will come in terms of enforceability. Because while there is a likelihood that we're going to have a persistent state of many mini metaverses, will every metaverse agree to build a penalty of sorts? That's the kind of scenario that we're dealing with. And that's an important question to bear in mind, because if that were the case, then, can you impose that on every single creator of a metaverse? Yeah. Once Nathaniel can come back on, he'll be able to share some of the challenges he has in terms of constructing the metaverse that he would like to build, while at the same time taking into account the fact that there may well be many of these compliance requirements, for example, building virtual prisons so that enforcement can be taken on such individuals. What would be the expression of a prison? Would it be some form of a sin bin? Would be a suspension of the person's account in the metaverse so he cannot operate effectively? These are necessary measures that need to be looked at empirically and assessed to ensure that whatever harm is imposed, the penalties that can be imposed can be effectively addressed in the real world as well as in the metaverse. So there's a fair bit of detail that needs to be looked at. Yeah. How are we going from a technical standpoint? Okay, looks like we're still trying to onboard Nathaniel. Yeah, let's move on to another question. So here's another one that is interesting as well. Can the regulator of real world regulate the irregularities of the virtual world? I wonder whether any of the panelists would like to chip in on this. Let me take a first stab, if I may. The regulators are I wouldn't say they're in a bind, but they certainly are able to look at this objectively because of the fact that when you look at the elements of what constitutes the metaverse, a lot of it does already exist in the gaming world, for example. And so when you deal with issues such as digital assets, you have to then go down to elements such as tokenization. Tokenization as a construct has been around for a fairly long period of time. It has been expressed in particular in the context of virtual currency. And so when you look at the context of financial regulators and looking at the payment infrastructure in the metaverse, I would expect that the learnings obtained in token management, the risk management aspects in terms of usage of cryptocurrency, the manner in which there is capacity building for individuals and unsophisticated investors. Those are the core things that need to be done. And again, it has. You'll notice, for example, progressive regulators like the Monetary Authority of Paul has taken extreme pains in accommodating both the need for innovative new business models in the manner in which we've embraced us. But at the same time, they have also jumped straight in to address the issue of risk to individuals and taken steps to ensure, for example, the advertising to individuals with regard to cryptocurrency usage, etc., purchase and trend and the use of such digital assets are done in a way that there's restrictions for unsophisticated investors and individuals. And that, I think, is an example of how regulators are aware of the risks and are able to regulate what the question has very nicely put, the irregularities of the virtual world. Now, we're still trying to get Nat on board. In the meantime, I do have some specific questions for Nathaniel when he comes back, but more specifically, perhaps for the other speakers that are online.
Rajesh, I just want to make sure you saw. It looks like we did get the technical issue taken care of, and it looks like we're ready for Net.
Wonderful. Nat, are you there? And if so, please take the floor. We have a slightly truncated time, so grateful if you could go.
Hi, no problem. Can everybody hear me here? Hello. Testing, 1, 2, 3. If everybody can hear me, thank you very much. Thanks everybody, and sorry for the technical issue. I think clearly technology and infrastructure will be and something to think about in the metaverse. My name is Nathaniel, and I'm one of the co-founders of Avium. If you go to the next slide, I have an introductory slide as to my background in Avium and what we do. You can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So, my name is Nathaniel. I was an ex-lawyer practicing in the whole tech space for close to over 10 years. And then after seeing some of my clients do really exciting things, I jumped over to the dark side, to what I call Web3. Now, Avium is a media content company building what we call the Metaverse layer of the content layer of the Metaverse. So Metaverse content through graphics, comics, film, and animation using Web3 and blockchain technology, NFT technology, so that these assets are co-owned by the consumers themselves as well. I stand at a very interesting crossroads of a few of these topics. So I was a lawyer, so I saw how laws evolved to deal with blockchain technology, metaverse technology as well. And now I run a business, and I think about the survivability and the profitability of businesses and how we're going to survive. And in this cross section of running a business involved in the metaverse and knowing the laws which apply and could apply, I stand at this intersection of how do we do business in the ethical way, and how the metaverse will interact with the real world, and what are these implications. So I just have 3 points to share today. Very quickly. First is the relevance of ethics, how and why ethics is relevant in the metaverse. I will share a bit more about what Avium does and this content called metaverse content, and specifically why some of these ethical issues are a bit more relevant to what we think about. And lastly, just briefly on public policy and public policy design of metaverses. So next slide, please. So if you think of metaverse, I think the prevailing understanding, if you can see from what most people talk about, is we see metaverses as virtual worlds, or a visual layer where we can exist upon what we call the UI UX, right? But what we really need to think about is that metaverses are going to be a lot more than just the visual UI UX layer and humans interacting as digital avatars. I'll talk more about the content that fills these worlds, but if you liken metaverses to virtual worlds or countries or cities, and if there's an ideal version, and if the ideal version of the metaverse is the translation of the physical world and everything we can do, then there's so much more that underlies a metaverse really, right? There could be so much more. And once you take a virtual world setting, you ask questions like, what is the financial exchange? Or what is the economy that that supports the exchange of value in the metaverse? What are the, from a legal perspective, what is the regulation or law that should be applied within the metaverse? What is the content, the experience that people go through, and what do they do, and what are activities that people conduct in the metaverse? I'll talk a bit more about these as to the content layer. But basically, when you put a group of people together, and when you have a community together, and when you have interaction, then it begs the question as to how do we regulate behavior amongst these people? What is the right or wrong thing to do? And ethics is really about design of what is right or wrong. So you can go back to the previous slide first. I just have four quick topics at the previous slide, please. No, this is the previous one. Yeah, one more. Yeah, correct. Yeah. So I just want to have four quick points I want to introduce before I jump in as to some of the deeper things we think about. I think when you talk about virtual world and a visual world, as you have people spending more and more time creating virtual items. For example, in Minecraft, people spend an amazing amount of time building virtual worlds and building buildings. People have built, for example, the whole of Hogwarts from Harry Potter inside Minecraft. Because they love hanging around Hogwarts, right? And people spend time, people spend money, people spend effort building this. I think the question here is that when you design the legal and commercial framework, who should own these buildings? Should it just be a pure license owned by Minecraft? As people spend more time and effort, what is the ethical way to reward ownership for some of these things? That's the first question to think about. The second question we can think about is access. I think some of us other speakers covered this. Is that should there be an equal right of access to metaverses and how and virtual worlds as we spend more and more time as it gets more prevalent. In the past, when the internet first started, I don't think this was an issue. But I think as the internet started to become more and more prevalent in our lives, being used in more and more channels, and more opportunities there, then the question is equal access to the metaverse a human right? Ethically, should metaverses be designed so that more and more people can access these things, or is it purely commercial? Is it only, for example, if you talk about wealth and equality, should there be a subscription fee for metaverses? Must people pay to participate? I think as we design these metaverses, some people need to think of these issues. The third area is about governance. If metaverses and virtual worlds are a collection of human beings put together and conducting whatever activities they want, should they be free to govern what they can do and what they cannot do? What is the basis for deciding on the governing law to control or to regulate behavior amongst these people? We talked about identity and how potentially your digital avatar is an extension, it's a virtual identity, it's an extension of your real identity. There's a right to vote in the virtual world as to what behavior is condoned, a feasible mechanism. We talked about cyberbullying. If everyone in the virtual world said, hey, as a matter of being a participant in this virtual world, we're fine with that, or we're fine exchanging we're fine with certain activities, is this going to be allowed? Is there an appropriate form of governance from an ethical point of view as to how should we decide on the rules of governance in a certain virtual world? The last point is about basic needs, and I think in the real world we talk about fundamental rights as to a concept of basic needs. You want to provide basic needs to education, to a standard of living, to water, for example. If data privacy, for example, in certain countries are recognized as a fundamental right or basic need for people, does this apply for virtual identities? Do we need to provide that kind of rules and governance for people participating there as well? Is there a concept of what is the basic need in a virtual metaverse when people interact? I think these are some of the deeper questions, and as metaverses and virtual worlds become more and more self-sustaining or independent from the physical world, as we move towards that, I think these are some of the ethical issues that potentially may turn out and be a bit more relevant as we design some of these. So I want to share a bit more as to what Avium does and why two of these topics are a bit more pertinent for us to think about when we design a business concerning metaverse. So if you move to the next slide, it's always fun to ask a few, it's always fun to ask questions, and lawyers love asking questions more than answering questions. I'll provide some of these answers later on. But I think, as I said, if you see metaverses as virtual platforms and the manifestation and visualization of our digital identities and self, worlds are a lot more than that, right? Worlds are, if you talk about the real world, we go through common experiences, we do things, right? We participate in a job, we exchange, we have common groups and organizations, we do things together. And really, currently at current state, you see visual and virtual worlds. I think a lot of virtual worlds are what we call not empty, but there is a missing content layer as to what people do there. Right? If you look at Sandbox or Decentraland or Roblox, you're just, it's an empty world where you're just congregating people together. But at a certain layer, you need content and common experience to bind people together and to bind a community together, so that they understand why they're here, the context as to why they're here, and what people are doing. So, for example, as a Singaporean, if I go to London, right, and I meet another Singaporean, I'm like, hey, from Singapore, we enjoy chili crab, we enjoy Hokkien mee, right? And because there's a content layer which binds us together, and as virtual worlds start to populate, we're gonna need to populate this with the content where people can interact and spend time together. What Avium is doing is building this content layer for the metaverse, and starting with the whole media animation layer, because I think that's a lot more approachable, and enabling co-ownership of this through NFT technology, where you can experience and you can own the content layer together. As a very basic analogy, you can think of it as Marvel Studios and creating Marvel, and how everybody in the world can enjoy a Marvel movie together and understand what's going on, but using blockchain and Web3 technology to enable co-ownership of that. So imagine owning a right to Iron Man, or owning a right to Spider-Man, and having that kind of ownership layer in amongst the people. So that's what Avium is doing. And because we are structuring as a metaverse content company, there are two more issues that we think about a bit more deeply. We can go to the next slide that I want to share about. The first is about ownership in this visual and virtual worlds, and rights of ownership. And like I said, if we are creating metaverses and virtuals, we are charging people time and spending. And if you look at how, for example, certain games where people spend not an insignificant amount of money, the question is, what rights should they own to their content? If you look at social media platforms when they first started, and this is a long time ago, right? When you posted a photo on a social media platform, there were certain platforms whereby the platform would actually own that photograph, and you had a mere license to it. I think after certain innovation and certain reflection or refinement, that model has changed, right? Now if you post a photo, you continue to own rights, but the platform owns, pretty much really broad licensing rights to use that photograph that you post on social media platforms. If you look at how metaverses and virtual worlds grow, we're going to have more and more of these questions. And from a blockchain, Web3, NFT technology, which is where I come from as well, I think you see a trend towards projects granting the consumers a broad range of commercialization rights, for example, under the Creative Commons license regime. I think the trend, what we are seeing, is that things are moving towards more open source type of ownership, whereby if you buy an NFT, for example, you would own the full right to use the graphic or the image to do whatever you want, because you're paying a high amount for that. I think as virtual worlds move towards being more prevalent in our lives and people spend more time, there's going to be a need for us to think a bit deeper as to who owns what should they own, and what is fair for people to own versus what the platform owns. I think there isn't going to be a clear-cut solution, because you're competing interests, obviously. There's the sustenance of the platform and what they can do, how much they're providing, and what the people are doing. I think one possible solution, and what we are looking at, for example, is how do we splice up separate rights to various parties? If you talk about ownership from a legal sense, ownership is really a bundle of commercial or a bundle of legal rights where you can use to the exclusion of others. And it's possible to splice up various rights so that it's a fairer design for people. What is the right ownership model and regime we need to think about in the virtual world? That's one thing we're thinking about because we are building content. We're telling people to buy Metaverse content and to participate in content. And therefore, for me at Avium, this is a more pertinent question that we need to think about. The second question, which is another trend in the whole Web3 blockchain area, is governance. And I touched on this. I think the theme of decentralization is becoming a hotter and hotter topic. I think when you have virtual worlds controlled by a single organization, then as these virtual worlds become more and more powerful and populated, then there is a growing danger of a bad actor, right? If a central organization controls the full rights and powers of this, then the more powerful they are, and obviously the more dangerous, if they decide to be a bad actor. I think the theme of decentralization is growing. If you look at blockchain technology and how decentralized finance, for example, is making a comeback as to a better way to do finance. I think when virtual worlds start to become bigger, people spending time there are going to want to have more control as to how they govern things inside. There's if you there's something called the decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, which are coming up, and these are really virtual voting structures in making decisions. I think more and more of these questions need to be answered as to who controls things. Do we give power to the community to make decisions together, and how they govern themselves in the visual worlds? I think some of these solutions are also going to be a bit more particular. It's not going to be a full-on, hey, you guys do everything and there's no central governing body, for example. And I think this is where we can distinguish, for example, action versus decisions, where people have a full right or independence to do what they can do in actions. But as to certain decisions which are more central to these worlds, it could be centralized to a certain governing body, for example, and depending on the growth of the platform and what stage they are in. I think these two questions are questions we ask a bit more deeper in the design of a metaverse, and I guess preempting some of the questions I think which will come as these virtual worlds become bigger and bigger. I'll move on to my last slide, which is really to summarize how ethics, regulation, law, business all coming together in a virtual and visual world. I think ethics is the question of what is right and wrong, and how do we decide what is right and wrong, or fair and unfair. That's really that question, right? The restrictions, and how do we restrict behavior, and why do we restrict behavior? Is it for the common good? Is it for independent human rights? I think once you put more and more people together, these are questions that we will need to ask. I think social media platforms, if you see in the last 10, 20 years, have been subjected to more and more ethical scrutiny, right? You talk about gamification and how, gaming, or for example, China called gaming a drug, they liken it to drug addiction. I think as virtual worlds become more and more persistent in our lives, as metaverses, become a bigger part and humans spend more time in these platforms, we will need to think deeper as to how do we decide what is good and bad for the better good, and how are we designing metaverses and virtual worlds and systems for the better good of humanity, more than just from a commercial kind of lens. That wraps up my presentation. Thank you very much for bearing with the technical difficulties, and I look forward to any further questions in the discussion with the panel.
Thank you very much, Nat. And I would like to thank every one of the panelists as well for bringing their own perspectives to the ethical and policy underpinnings of the metaverse today. I just wanted to take, I think we only have a couple of minutes just to wrap up very quickly on the core issues that have been raised by the various speakers, and to leave with all of you some questions to ponder. We are moving into a multiplicity of existence, where we have both the reality of the physical world we live in, as well as the metaversal realities that we need to address. While these bring significant opportunities in terms of revenue generation, in terms of the ability for us to express ourselves differently in each of these metaverses, one cannot help but think about examples learned from the media today, as well as, I must add, because I simply can't ever forget the movie that I just watched with Michelle Yeoh, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. that is a phenomenal movie, and I'm sure she'll be up there for Best Actress. And in that movie, if you have not yet watched it, please find a way to watch that movie. You will see the potential impact of an individual subjected to a multiple series of existence, and sometimes the fact that these existences can cross over in terms of the impact. And at other times, you can leave the issue behind, as in I'll die in one world, but I'll survive in the other. These points, while many of us will want to take the view that, well, it's okay, existing policies can work, existing laws can be expanded, require a leap into an unknown area of multiplicity of existence. It leads into a need for us to look at resolution and remedies that have an impact both in the real world as well as in the multiverse and the metaverse. And these are not things that existing policies will address. These are not things that existing laws as they stand will necessarily address in the full spectrum of what is expected. A clear example will be in Singapore, the case of CLM versus CLN, Singapore High Court 2022. That case in particular, which was litigated by my fellow partner Danny Lim successfully for the plaintiff, is an example of where the courts have recognized that digital assets can be frozen. In this context, virtual money kept in an e-wallet, such that the person who had stolen the money cannot use that money anymore. The question that you need to ask is this: it is great that such an injunction can be achieved. It is excellent that digital assets can be treated as if it were property and real assets. But is justice actually served? Can the person actually be found? And is that restitution sufficient to know that you've closed the person's wallet and that person cannot use that wrongfully gained funds? But at the same time, the person who had lost the money may likely never get that money back again that was invested in the e-wallet. Is that new justice in the metaverse? Is that good enough? And it is examples like this that show that while we are progressing step by step in bringing our ethical policy and legal frameworks in place, there is still work to be done for us to make sure that this new metaverse, the new opportunities that are there before us, are used for good, and people who seek to abuse their positions are adequately dealt with, both in the physical and the virtual world, both in the physical and the metaversal world, and then we can move forward and really enjoy the full fruits of the new world that we're all moving into. That's it for now. I just want to take the opportunity again to thank all of the speakers. Nat, thank you for bearing in there and so rapidly fixing it and coming back on stream. Glad that you got a chance to present. Thank you, Philip. The organizational risks that you've highlighted are things that each of us need to take back to our companies and think carefully. Are we ready from our policies and the approaches, the training, the cultural changes that you very clearly highlighted? Are these things that are understood? Should there be adequate capacity building at an organizational level? Thank you, Dr. Hang Yi Chen, in terms of your sharing, in terms of digital identity, all of the foundational issues in terms of when you are in the metaverse, what can you do? How do you deal with digital assets? What is Web 3.3? What is Web 3.0 in a real world construct and in the metaversal construct? Thank you for sharing that. And Samir, bringing it real, making it real in terms of us as individuals, expressing ourselves there, and potentially, the harms that may occur, how these can be addressed. I want to thank you all for your time, for your energy, for sharing so openly with all of us. And thank you also to the audience for the questions that you have posed. We had a chance to address 2 or 3 of them. I wish, as always, that we had more time, but I hope that this discussion can carry on in the metaverse as we discuss further. Please stay on for the upcoming panels where we'll go even deeper into various aspects of the metaverse. With that, thank you very much, and I hand back to Karina and the crew at TechLaw.Fest. Thank you all. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you.